Snow lay in a hard crust over Moscow as carts creaked along the frozen streets, surrounded by crowds of hollow-eyed peasants. They pushed forward with bony hands, clawing at sacks of coarse rye flour, while armed guards tried to hold them back. Frost clung to torn clothing, beards and eyelashes. Children stumbled in the slush, too weak to cry, as scraps of black bread passed from hand to trembling hand and disappeared almost instantly. Beyond the city walls, bodies lay in frozen rows along the roadsides and open fields, stiff beneath thin layers of snow. Foreign envoys rode past wagons stacked with corpses, noting the silence of villages where smoke no longer rose from chimneys. In back alleys, starving men and women offered themselves and their children into bondage for a few measures of grain. Rumours spread that boyars had locked full granaries, waiting for prices to climb higher. In the markets, shouting turned to panic as grain prices leapt to 10 or even 20 times their former cost. People smashed stalls and storage sheds, dragging officials from doorways and beating them in the slush. State granaries stood nearly bare, and the name of Tsar Boris Godunov was cursed in crowded churches and smoky taverns. Amid this hunger, talk of false tsars and foreign saviours moved from whispers to open pledges as the authority of centuries crumbled under the weight of empty stomachs. In the dim light of a storeroom in Lagash, scribes pressed reed stylus into wet clay, fixing columns of numbers beside a simple sign for grain. Each tablet captured rations measured to the litre, the flow of barley from peasant fields into temple granaries and out again to labourers and soldiers. Authority rested on these records. Grain fed the men who dug canals, guarded walls and hauled stone, so shortages meant not just hunger, but failing irrigation, unpaid fighters and eroding power. Far to the west, Egyptian officials watched the Nile climb the calibrated steps of nilometers, reading the river as a ledger of future order or turmoil. High water promised full granaries, paid corvée labour and calm villages. A weak inundation warned of thin harvests, late taxes and angry farmers. Hieroglyphic inscriptions linked levels of flood to offerings, levies and relief from royal stores. When the river fell short for more than one season, murmurs spread along the valley and local elites tested the limits of pharaonic control. Across pre-industrial worlds, rulers lived with that same fragility. A failed monsoon in South Asia, a fungus blackening rye in Europe, a campaign that kept men and draft animals far from their fields, or damp granaries where stored grain spoiled or ignited in mould, all could turn a lean year into catastrophe. In Paris, crowds once stormed bakeries when flour grew scarce. In late Qing China, officials seized grain as drought and corruption bit. When states failed to keep bread and rice moving, markets faltered, village loyalties hardened, and even the loyalty of hungry soldiers wavered. Around the eastern Mediterranean, shrinking harvests had thinned the lifeblood of the great Bronze Age courts. Fields that once yielded ample barley now produced only stunted stalks. In the pollen grains trapped beneath lakes and marshes, drier, hardier plants replaced species that thrived in wetter conditions, marking years of scant rainfall. On the surface, stone storehouses stood half empty. Scribes recorded reduced rations for workers, and officials quietly curtailed food distributions to temples and dependent households. In the Hittite realm, royal orders demanded grain be pulled from distant estates, rushed toward the royal centres and diverted to sustain chariot forces that could not forage from exhausted countryside. Caravans moved under guard, while local villagers watched wagons loaded with their remaining surplus roll toward fortresses. Correspondents spoke of granaries sealed, inventories checked and rechecked, and commanders warned that without steady bread, horses weakened, garrisons deserted, and border outposts stood only in name. Across the sea lanes, Ugarit looked outward for rescue. Clay tablets recorded pleas for grain from Allied ports, yet also spoke of hostile ships that prowled the coast, seizing cargoes and burning fields near harbours. As long-distance trade faltered, markets emptied of staple foodstuffs, and workshops lost both wages and customers. When raiding bands and the Sea Peoples arrived, they met cities already strained by hunger, their walls guarded by underfed soldiers, their rulers unable to buy loyalty with the one currency that mattered most, grain. Low hulls rode deep in the water as grain ships cleared the Nile Delta, their holds packed with Egyptian wheat assessed as tax for a distant capital. Crews watched the coastline fall away, knowing these sacks of grain meant survival for crowded tenements far beyond the sea's horizon. From Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily, convoys converged, funneled through the Mediterranean's changing winds toward Ostia and Puteoli, where officials, soldiers, and dockworkers waited to claim Rome's lifeline in measured rations. In Rome, long porticos and granaries framed the rhythm of the annona as state clerks recorded allotments and poor citizens queued for their monthly share. The city's calm depended on these distributions. When shipments faltered in 19 CE, stores shrank, prices soared, and anxious crowds packed the forum, blaming the emperor for empty markets. Tacitus later described how fear of hunger turned murmurs into threats, and how Tiberius, facing resentment and suspicion, saw his authority tremble with every missing cargo. During the 3rd century, turmoil spread along the sea routes that fed the capital. North African estates burned in revolts, enemy raids tested coastal defences, and some ports passed into the hands of rivals who diverted grain to their own supporters. Emperors, such as Septimius Severus, had once expanded free rations to secure loyalty. Now, usurpers tried to do the same by seizing harbours and fleets. When Vandals conquered North Africa in the 5th century, Rome lost a principal breadbasket, and the Western Empire struggled to withstand the combined weight of military defeat and chronic scarcity. Fields along the Nile lay cracked and pale when the river rose only weakly against its banks. Surveyors measured the flood at the Nilometers and recorded levels too low to spill into the irrigation basins. Scribes noted half-harvests and shrinking granaries as barley and emmer yields fell. In village markets, baskets of grain became smaller, while prices climbed beyond the reach of labourers. Officials counted arrears in tax registers, already sensing the strain on a system built upon an annual surplus. Between 1064 and 1072, under the Fatimid caliphs, those weak inundations followed one another with unusual persistence. Storehouses emptied, and caravans arriving at Fustat carried less grain and demanded more gold. Al-Makrizi later described streets where people fought over scraps of spoiled bread and stripped the flesh from dead animals left in rubbish heaps. Reports circulated of parents selling children to survive and of bodies dug from cemeteries for food. Soldiers gathered before arsenals and treasuries, shouting for pay that no longer came on time or in usable coin. The treasury's receipts withered as fields went unwatered, and tax farmers found nothing left to collect. Coinage lost weight and purity, and payments in debased dinars angered troops who still held weapons and training. Mutinies flared in garrisons guarding key routes, while abandoned villages dotted the floodplain. Centuries earlier, inscriptions from late Old Kingdom tombs had spoken of hunger and empty granaries during another prolonged series of low floods, coinciding with geological evidence of drought and the disintegration of centralized rule around 2200 BCE. Dust rose over the Los plains as dry winds stripped the fields bare. Records in the Book of the Later Han described summers without rain and skies darkened by locust swarms that devoured what little grain remained. Irrigation channels cracked, wells ran low, and village granaries emptied. Peasant households sold tools and livestock, then children, then themselves, and still fell behind on taxes. Imperial officials continued to demand grain and coin, while their own storehouses stayed guarded and full. Whispers of a healing faith and a coming great peace reached villages where hunger had become permanent. Itinerant preachers promised protection from disease and injustice, and offered shared meals to those who gathered. Men and women who could no longer keep their fields signed on as followers, tying yellow cloth around their heads. When the yellow turban banners rose in 184 CE, many who charged local magistrate offices had once knelt there as taxpayers. Garrisons faltered as hungry conscripts deserted and provinces slipped from imperial control. Centuries later, in the late Ming era, cold springs and parched summers returned across the northern plains. Tree rings and ice cores later showed how deeply the Little Ice Age had gripped the region, while county gazetteers listed one failed harvest after another. In Shanxi and neighbouring provinces, villagers boiled bark and weeds, then starved in the shadows of tax granaries. Bandit bands grew into armies as men joined leaders such as Li Zicheng for the promise of food and relief from levies. By 1644, these forces swarmed toward Beijing, and as rebels entered the capital, the Chongzhen emperor hanged himself among the palace trees. Across 2 millennia, collapsing harvests had again turned scattered despair into the power to unseat a dynasty. In April 1815, Mount Tambora in the Dutch East Indies exploded with a violence that shook the planet. Columns of ash and sulphurous gases pierced the stratosphere, where high winds spread them like a thin, sun-dimming veil around the globe. Months later, the effects reached Europe and North America as an invisible winter. Scientific instruments recorded falling temperatures, while observers noted a strange pall in the sky and sunsets stained with unusual coppery colours. By 1816, fields in Switzerland, New England and Ireland lay under frosts that arrived in June. Wheat and oats failed to ripen, hay harvests shrank and cattle weakened as fodder ran short. In market towns, grain prices climbed beyond the reach of labourers. Crowds gathered at bakeries and storehouses. In parts of Britain and continental Europe, anger boiled over into food riots. In German states, hungry weavers and artisans joined demonstrations that mixed demands for bread with calls for reform. Authorities searched for remedies but found narrow margins. Prussia halted grain exports to keep food within its borders, while some municipalities subsidized bread or opened emergency granaries. The measures eased immediate suffering, yet revealed how limited early 19th century governments remained in the face of climatic shock. Chroniclers compared this scarcity to earlier disasters of the Little Ice Age, invoking the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when relentless rain rotted crops and even monarchs such as Edward II could not prevent hunger. Dry winds had blown across Madras, Bombay and the Deccan in the late 1870s, stripping moisture from already withered fields. The El Niño-linked monsoon failure had left tanks empty and canals reduced to sluggish threads of water. Millet and rice stalks stood stunted. Bullocks pulled ploughs through dust instead of soil. Yet trains and bullock carts still carried sacks of grain toward coastal ports, where merchants loaded them onto ships bound for Britain. In the offices of the Viceroy in Calcutta, telegrams described rising prices and starving villages, while officials cited fears of distorting the market. Laissez-faire doctrine shaped policy more than the bodies on the roads. Relief works opened, but labourers breaking stones and laying railway track received rations calculated to be barely sufficient. Men, women and children trudged long distances for this work, collapsing at the sites as diseases followed hunger. Millions never returned to their fields. Decades later, in 1943, rice paddies in Bengal lay flattened by cyclones and floods, and wartime demands tightened imperial control over grain. Military procurement, shipping shortages, and speculation drove prices upward until poor families sold their tools and cooking pots for a handful of rice. Reports of hoarding and skeletal bodies reached London. Winston Churchill's cabinet debated shipping but prioritised other fronts. Ships sailed past starving coasts, and mass death advanced through Bengal's villages and city streets. In Ukraine in 1932 and 1933, fields lay under snow, while grain depots in nearby towns remained guarded and sealed. Soviet decrees demanded impossible procurement quotas from newly collectivized farms, and special brigades moved from village to village, searching homes and barns for hidden food. Blacklists cut entire communities off from trade. Those who tried to glean leftover stalks from state fields faced arrest. Reports from local party officials quietly recorded swollen bellies, abandoned children, and fields left untilled as hunger consumed the countryside. Across the grain-growing regions of Ukraine, the Kuban, and the Lower Volga, the same pattern unfolded. Internal communications counted rail cars of grain dispatched to cities and for export, while mortality figures remained suppressed or falsified. Peasants, forbidden to leave famine-stricken areas without internal passports, collapsed along village roads. Yet the Soviet leadership insisted on success, treating complaints as sabotage. The memory of confiscations and closed borders lingered. In later decades, rural Ukrainians remembered party activists breaking down doors, reinforcing a deep sense of betrayal toward Moscow's rule. In China, during the Great Leap Forward, loudspeakers praised record harvests as villagers lined up at communal canteens, unaware that grain reserves were already thinning. Local cadres, under pressure to exceed targets, inflated production figures. State requisitions then removed not only any surplus, but part of the staple food needed for survival. Poor weather and campaigns against sparrows and other pests disrupted ecological balances, worsening crop failures. Provincial reports described starving families stripping bark from trees, fields overrun with weeds, and party members privately questioning the wisdom of directives they still publicly endorsed. Across the rushing scenes, the same pattern stood out. In Anatolia, envoys from a weakened Hittite court had stretched out their hands for foreign grain as drought shrank their harvests. In Rome, crowds had pressed against bakery doors when shipments faltered, turning price spikes into street violence. In India, under the Raj, columns of villagers had walked for days toward relief works, trading exhausted bodies for a few coarse rations and the chance to survive another season. In each case, weather and crop failure had struck first, but power had decided who starved. Elites secured granaries while rural households sold tools, animals, and finally land. Officials enforced contracts and taxes as if nothing had changed, or clung to theories that markets alone would feed the hungry. Where rulers had intervened early, opening stores, suspending levies, and redirecting transport to grain, armies held together and cities kept functioning through lean years. The same logic reappeared in the 2007-2008 food price crisis, when sudden spikes helped ignite riots from Port-au-Prince to Cairo, and in recent fears over climate-driven harvest failures and export bans. On frozen streets in 1601 Moscow, people had scavenged bark and carrion while carts bearing grain rolled toward guarded compounds. Their hunger showed how quickly authority eroded when fields failed, stores stayed shut, and the basic work of keeping people fed fell apart.